After 45 days in a coma, a millionaire wakes up to a stranger beside him. What she reveals changes everything. Drew Kensington's penthouse glittered with cold perfection, its glass walls framing a skyline that seemed to bow before his wealth. Inside, Drew sat at the head of a marble dining table, sipping an aged scotch, his face a mask of indifference. His assistant rattled off numbers about a lucrative acquisition, but Drew wasn't listening. To him, people were assets to manage, just like his companies. Relationships? A liability he couldn't afford. At 44, Drew had everything, or so the world thought. A fleet of luxury cars, invitations to exclusive galas, and a bank account that rivaled small nations. Yet, his laughter rang hollow, his nights spent alone despite the throngs of admirers. It wasn't that he didn't want connection. It was that he didn't believe in it. Far from Drew's glittering world, Mayara Alvarez stood behind the counter of a modest boutique, folding shirts under flickering fluorescent lights. Her hands, calloused from long hours, moved mechanically as her mind wandered to her sister Carla. Carla's medication bills had drained their savings, and the thought of losing her made Mayara's chest tighten. But she couldn't crumble. Carla needed her strength. That evening, Drew's world and Mayara's collided in a way neither could predict. While speeding to an investor meeting, Drew's car skidded on a rain-slick road. The crash was deafening, his pristine vehicle reduced to twisted metal. Drew's unconscious body was rushed to a local clinic, one Mayara frequented with Carla. Standing in the clinic's hallway, Mayara watched as the stretcher passed, the man's lifeless expression somehow tugging at her heart. She didn't know his name, but something about him felt familiar. She shook her head, pushing the thought aside. There was no time for strangers when her sister's life hung in the balance. The clinic was no place for the rich. Faded walls and a persistent hum of flickering lights told stories of struggle. Yet it was here that Drew's unconscious body was placed. Mayara found herself lingering near his room, an inexplicable pull keeping her close. "He has no one," one of the nurses murmured, glancing at Drew's chart. "No emergency contacts, no family. Just a credit card for expenses. No one." The word echoed in Mayara's mind. How could someone so clearly wealthy be utterly alone? As Carla rested in the adjacent ward, Mayara stepped into Drew's room, her gaze softening as she took in his still form. His face was marred by cuts, but beneath them lay the hint of a man once full of life. Days turned into weeks. Mayara didn't know why she stayed, but she did. Between shifts and Carla's treatments, she'd sit by Drew's bedside, reading aloud from old magazines or adjusting the blanket when the room grew cold. "You probably have a world waiting for you," she whispered one evening. "But here you are, just like the rest of us." What she didn't realize was how much her presence mattered. The nurses noticed the way Drew's vitals steadied when she was near, the faint twitch of his fingers as she spoke. Mayara dismissed it as coincidence. One day, as she held Carla's hand in the next room, Drew's fingers moved with purpose. His eyelids fluttered, and a faint groan escaped his lips. The sound jolted Mayara from her thoughts. Rushing back to his bedside, she froze as his eyes opened for the first time in 45 days. Drew Kensington had awakened, but the man staring back at Mayara was no longer the one who had lived a life of indifference. Drew's eyes fluttered open, the room swimming in and out of focus. The sterile white ceiling above him was cracked, far removed from the polished perfection he was accustomed to. A faint hum of voices drifted from the hallway, but all he could hear was the pounding in his chest. Pain shot through his body as he tried to move, forcing a groan from his lips. "Where am I?" His voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. Mayara, seated quietly nearby, froze for a moment before stepping closer. "You're in the clinic," she said softly, her tone steady yet laced with concern. "You've been unconscious for a long time." Drew squinted at her, trying to place the unfamiliar face. She wasn't like anyone he knew. No designer clothes, no polished demeanor. Yet, there was a warmth in her presence that disarmed him. "How long?" he croaked. Mayara hesitated before answering. 45 days. The words hit him like a blow. 45 days? He tried to piece together what had happened. his mind foggy with fragments of memory. The rain, the screech of tires, the crash. Everything else was blank. As he processed her words, Mayara adjusted the blanket over him. You were lucky to survive. Now, you need to focus on recovering. Her tone was practical, but her eyes betrayed something deeper. Drew wanted to say something, to ask why she was there, but exhaustion swallowed him whole. He drifted back into a restless sleep, unaware that in the days to come, the quiet presence of the woman beside him would begin to unravel everything he thought he knew about life and himself. The clinic was a far cry from the hospitals Drew was used to. Cramped hallways, flickering lights, and a hum of quiet desperation in the air. As days passed, Drew became more aware of his surroundings and of Mayara, the woman who had seemingly taken on the role of his caretaker. Why are you doing this? Drew asked one afternoon, his voice stronger now, but tinged with suspicion. Mayara paused, her fingers lingering on the glass of water she'd brought him. Someone had to, she replied simply, avoiding his gaze. The answer gnawed at him. Drew, a man who had built his life on transactions and clear motives, couldn't fathom someone helping without expecting something in return. But Mayara didn't elaborate, leaving him to wonder. For Mayara, taking care of Drew had become an odd solace amidst her own struggles. Carla's health continued to decline, and the mounting medical bills loomed over her like a storm. Yet, being with Drew gave her moments of calm, a strange reprieve from her relentless reality. As Drew regained strength, he began noticing the world around him in ways he never had before. The kindness of the overworked nurses, the quiet resilience of the patients, and the way Mayara always seemed to put others first. One evening, as Mayara adjusted the curtains in his room, Drew watched her closely. "Who are you really?" he asked, his tone softer now, curiosity replacing suspicion. Mayara hesitated, her gaze fixed on the window. "Sometimes, life puts us in places we never planned to be," she said quietly. "Maybe this is one of those times." Her words lingered, stirring something in Drew. For the first time in years, he found himself wanting to understand someone else, not as an asset or a problem to solve, but as a person. Recovery was slow and riddled with frustration. Drew, once commanding boardrooms and dictating the fate of multimillion-dollar deals, now struggled to lift a spoon. Every muscle in his body ached, but the sting to his pride was sharper. Each time he faltered, his jaw clenched, the image of the powerful man he used to be crumbling in his mind. Mayara was patient. She didn't hover, but was always there when he needed her. "Take your time," she said one afternoon as he fought to steady his trembling hands. Her words were simple, but something about the calm in her voice softened the edge of his frustration. Drew started noticing the little things. The way she hummed softly while tidying the room, the faint sadness in her eyes when she thought no one was looking. It intrigued him. He found himself wanting to know more, to understand what brought her here. "Why do you stay?" Drew asked one day, his voice breaking the silence. Mayara hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. "It's complicated," she replied, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Complicated. The word lingered between them, but Drew didn't press further. For the first time in years, he realized that not every answer needed to be immediate. That evening, as he sat alone in the dim light of his room, Drew's thoughts drifted back to the life he'd left behind. The penthouses, the parties, the power, it all felt distant now, almost hollow. He glanced toward the hallway where Mayara had just disappeared, and for the first time, he wondered if what he had been chasing all along had never truly mattered. The clinic buzzed with quiet activity, but Drew's world had narrowed to the rhythm of Mayara's comings and goings. She had become a constant, her presence grounding him in a way he didn't understand. But Mayara was careful, always steering conversations away from herself. One morning, as she adjusted the flowers on his bedside table, Drew spoke again. "You know so much about me now. It's only fair I know something about you." Mayara stilled, her fingers brushing the petals. "There's not much to tell," she said lightly, but her tone betrayed her. Drew wasn't convinced. "You're here every day, taking care of a stranger. That doesn't come from nowhere." His words were gentle but insistent. Mayara sighed, sitting at the edge of the chair near his bed. "My sister," she began, her voice quiet. "She's sick. The kind of sick that doesn't wait for anyone to catch up. She's the reason I'm here, why I even know about this place." Her confession hung heavy in the room. Drew, who had always thought of illness as something you could throw money at until it disappeared, felt an unfamiliar pang in his chest. "Does she have everything she needs?" he asked carefully. Mayara shook her head. "We get by," she said, forcing a smile. "That's all anyone can do." Drew didn't press further, but the weight of her words stayed with him. For the first time in his life, he felt powerless. Not because he couldn't fix something, but because he wanted to in a way that wasn't about control or obligation. It was something else entirely, something new. The days passed, each one chipping away at the walls Drew had built around himself. He spent hours lying in his narrow bed, replaying fragments of his past life. He saw the boardrooms filled with polished strangers, the glittering galas where he stood alone in a sea of admirers. Those memories, once a source of pride, now felt like someone else's life, cold and detached. Mayara was a stark contrast to everything he'd ever known. Her presence was unpolished yet steady, her kindness offered without expectation. She didn't ask him about his past, and for that he was grateful. But it also left him yearning to share, to bridge the growing silence between them. One evening, as Mayara sat nearby, sorting through paperwork for Carla's treatments, Drew finally broke the stillness. "Do you ever feel stuck?" he asked, his voice hesitant. Mayara paused, looking at him curiously. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but life doesn't wait for us to catch up. We just have to keep moving, even when it feels impossible." Her words hit him harder than he expected. Drew, who had always prided himself on control, realized that he had spent his life running. From people, from pain, from himself. But Mayara didn't run. She faced her struggles head-on, even as they threatened to break her. That night, Drew lay awake, her words echoing in his mind. For the first time, he didn't feel consumed by his own frustration. Instead, he felt something else entirely: admiration. Drew's strength returned slowly, and with it came the desire to repay the kindness he'd been shown. He noticed how Mayara balanced her time between caring for him and managing Carla's needs. The strain on her was evident, yet she never complained. One afternoon, as Mayara was tidying the room, Drew cleared his throat. "Mayara," he began, "I want to help you." She turned to him, her brow furrowing. "You already are. You're recovering, and that's what matters." "No," he insisted, his tone firm. "I mean you and Carla. I can make things easier for you." Mayara froze, her shoulders stiffening. "Drew, I don't need charity," she said, her voice sharp but controlled. "We've managed this long, and we'll keep managing." "It's not charity," he argued, struggling to sit up. "It's gratitude. You've done more for me than anyone ever has. Let me do something for you in return." Mayara's expression softened, but a shadow of uncertainty remained in her eyes. "I appreciate the offer," she said quietly, "but this isn't about what you can give. It's about what you've already started to change in yourself." Her words stunned him. Drew, who had spent his life measuring worth in numbers, was beginning to understand a new kind of value, one that couldn't be bought or sold. He nodded slowly, deciding not to push her further. But as Mayara left the room, Drew silently resolved to help her and Carla, whether she wanted him to or not. For the first time in his life, he wanted to give, not for recognition or power, but simply because it felt right. Drew couldn't shake the determination growing inside him. As he regained his strength, his mind worked tirelessly, weaving plans to help Mayara and Carla without overstepping her pride. He observed Mayara's resilience with a newfound reverence, yet her exhaustion was impossible to ignore. Every time she returned from Carla's appointments, her shoulders seemed heavier, her eyes darker with worry. One evening, as the clinic fell into its usual quiet hum, Drew called out to her. "Mayara, sit with me for a moment." She hesitated but eventually took the chair by his bedside. "You've given so much," he began, choosing his words carefully. "But who takes care of you?" Mayara laughed softly, a sound devoid of humor. "I don't have that luxury," she replied. When Carla got sick, my life stopped being about me. The vulnerability in her voice cut through him like a blade. You shouldn't have to do this alone, he said gently. I've been alone before, Mayara admitted, her gaze dropping to her hands. But now I have Carla. That's enough for me. Her selflessness both inspired and infuriated him. Drew had spent a lifetime surrounded by people, yet had never truly connected with anyone. Meanwhile, Mayara bore the weight of the world and still found room to care for a stranger. He reached out, his hand brushing hers. You don't have to keep doing this alone, he said firmly, his voice carrying a conviction he barely recognized. Mayara's lips parted as if to respond, but she said nothing. For the first time, she allowed herself to be still, sitting with the weight of her own unspoken fears while Drew's presence offered a quiet, unspoken promise. The next morning, Drew asked one of the nurses to help him. It had taken days of observation and piecing together hints, but he finally uncovered the clinic's connection to Carla's care. He learned about the mounting bills and the treatment options Mayara hadn't dared to hope for. When Mayara returned to Drew's room after checking on Carla, she noticed an envelope on the table beside his bed. What's this? She asked, holding it up. It's for you, Drew said, his tone casual. Mayara opened it cautiously, her brow furrowing as she unfolded a printed statement. Her eyes widened as she read the contents, a confirmation of payment covering the next 6 months of Carla's treatment. Her gaze snapped to Drew, her expression a mixture of anger and disbelief. You did this? Yes, he admitted. And before you say anything, it's not about pity. It's about gratitude. You saved my life, Mayara. Let me save hers. Tears welled in her eyes, and for a moment, she seemed torn between gratitude and frustration. Drew, you didn't have to. I know, he interrupted, but I wanted to. Carla deserves the chance you've fought so hard to give her. Mayara's shoulders trembled as she clutched the paper, her walls crumbling under the weight of relief. For the first time, she allowed herself to cry, the tears spilling freely as years of tension unraveled. Drew watched in silence, his heart swelling with a strange, unfamiliar warmth. It wasn't just satisfaction, it was purpose. For once, his wealth had brought something real and tangible into someone's life. Mayara's tears caught Drew off guard. He had expected resistance, even anger, but not this raw, unguarded emotion. She wiped her face quickly, as if ashamed of her vulnerability, but Drew spoke before she could retreat into herself. It's okay, he said softly. You don't always have to be the strong one. Mayara shook her head, letting out a shaky laugh. I've been strong for so long, I don't know how to be anything else. Drew studied her, the words lodging in his chest. How could someone so unassuming carry such weight alone? You don't have to do it alone anymore, he said quietly. Mayara looked at him, her defenses slipping just enough for him to see the tired woman beneath the resilience. Drew, this is more than I ever thought I'd have. But she hesitated, her voice faltering. What happens when you leave? The question stunned him. Leave? The idea felt foreign, though he hadn't considered what his recovery meant for the future. His life, his empire, waited for him beyond the walls of this clinic. Yet, for the first time, the thought of returning to it felt hollow. I don't know, Drew admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. But for now, I'm here. For you. For Carla. Mayara's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes scanning his face as though searching for a lie. When she found none, she nodded, her expression softening. Thank you, she whispered, the words trembling with sincerity. Drew realized then that this wasn't just about repayment. For the first time in his life, he was building something real, a connection that couldn't be bought or measured. Drew's recovery progressed faster than anyone anticipated. Each day, he grew stronger, walking unsteadily down the clinic's halls, guided by Mayara's patient encouragement. He found solace in their quiet conversations, her stories about Carla's dreams and their struggles pulling him deeper into their world. One afternoon, while sitting outside the clinic for the first time since his accident, Drew turned to Mayara. What does Carla want most? He asked. Mayara smiled wistfully. To be normal again, to finish her studies, maybe travel someday. She talks about Paris like it's another planet. Drew leaned back, absorbing her words. He had been to Paris dozens of times, but he couldn't recall ever seeing it through the lens of wonder Mayara described. You should take her someday, he said, his tone light. Mayara laughed softly. Right? Between medical bills and rent, I'll book that trip any day now. Drew's chest tightened at her words. The sacrifices Mayara made for Carla were staggering, yet she carried them without complaint. He had spent his life chasing success, but sitting beside Mayara, he began to see the hollow nature of his accomplishments. As they sat in silence, Drew reached for her hand, a small gesture that felt monumental. Mayara tensed at first, but then she relaxed, letting their fingers intertwine. It was a simple connection, but it spoke volumes. In that moment, Drew understood something he hadn't before. His wealth, his power, his influence. They meant nothing if they didn't serve something greater. And for the first time, he felt ready to let them go, if it meant holding on to the fragile, beautiful thing he had found with Mayara. Drew's steps were surer now, his body regaining strength, but his mind remained restless. The days spent with Mayara and the stories of Carla's courage filled him with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. Yet, an invisible tether pulled him back to the world he had left behind, a world that was starting to feel more like a prison than a home. One evening, Drew received his first visitor since the accident. Nicholas, his longtime assistant and the closest thing he had to a friend. Nicholas's sharp suit and brisk demeanor seemed out of place in the humble clinic. Drew, Nicholas began, his voice tinged with relief and urgency. We've been trying to reach you. The board is restless, and there are deals on the line. You need to return. Drew felt a pang of guilt, but also a flicker of annoyance. I'm not ready, he said firmly. Nicholas frowned. You've been gone for weeks. If you don't step back in now, you might lose everything. Mayara, who had been quietly tidying the room, paused, her back stiffening. Drew caught the flicker of hurt in her eyes before she turned away, pretending not to listen. Maybe I don't want it all back, Drew said, his voice low but steady. Nicholas stared at him, stunned. What are you saying? I'm saying that maybe there's more to life than chasing numbers, Drew replied, glancing toward Mayara. More than power and profits. Nicholas sighed, his tone softening. You've built an empire, Drew. Don't throw it away for sentimentality. But Drew wasn't swayed. For the first time, he saw his empire for what it was, a gilded cage. And though he didn't say it aloud, he knew what he truly feared losing wasn't in a boardroom. It was standing quietly in the corner, trying to disappear. After Nicholas left, the tension in the room lingered like a storm cloud. Mayara moved with mechanical precision, avoiding Drew's gaze as she rearranged the flowers by his bedside. Mayara, Drew said softly, his voice breaking the silence. She didn't turn. You don't have to explain, she said, her tone carefully neutral. Yes, I do, he insisted, his words firmer. You overheard, and I need you to know. I'm not the man I was before. Mayara finally faced him, her arms crossed protectively. And what man are you now, Drew? The one who sees people as more than transactions? Or the one who can walk away the moment something more convenient comes along? Her words struck like a whip, cutting through his defenses. Drew rose from the bed, unsteady but resolute. I don't want to walk away, he said, his voice raw with emotion. But I can't pretend my past doesn't exist. I need to decide what to do with it. Mayara's expression softened, but her eyes remained wary. You have a life waiting for you out there. I don't blame you for wanting it back. Drew shook his head. That life feels like someone else's. Everything I thought I needed, everything I worked for, it feels empty now. Mayara searched his face, the walls she had built around herself starting to crack. So, what do you want, Drew? I want to be the kind of man who deserves to be here, he said quietly. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Mayara stepped closer, her voice barely a whisper. That man doesn't need to prove himself to anyone but you. Her words hung in the air, a quiet challenge and an undeniable truth. Drew nodded, his resolve hardening. He didn't just want to leave his old life behind. He wanted to build something entirely new, and he knew where it had to start. Drew spent the following days wrestling with his future. The clinic had become his sanctuary, a place where he had found clarity and connection, yet the echoes of his old life grew louder. Calls from Nicholas became more frequent, each one laden with the pressure of returning to his empire. Mayara, perceptive as always, noticed the strain in his eyes. One afternoon, as she sat beside him, folding a blanket, she broke the silence. "You're leaving soon, aren't you?" Her words weren't accusatory, but they cut deeply. Drew hesitated before nodding. "I have to go," he admitted, his voice heavy. "But not because I want to." Mayara's hands stilled, her fingers clutching the fabric tightly. "Drew, I don't want you to feel trapped here. If going back is what you need, you should." "That's the problem," he replied, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "I don't know what I need. All I know is that being here, with you and Carla, has made me see what I've been missing." Mayara's lips pressed into a thin line, her composure wavering. "And what happens when a novelty wears off? When life gets hard, and you realize this isn't the world you know?" "It's not a novelty," Drew said firmly, leaning forward despite the strain it placed on his still healing body. "It's the first time my life has felt real." Mayara looked away, her breath unsteady. "I've been let down before, Drew. I can't afford to believe in something that might not last." Her words pierced him, but he didn't flinch. "Then I'll prove it to you," he said quietly. "I'll prove that I'm not that man anymore." The weight of the promise hung between them, fragile yet unshakable, like a thread tying their worlds together. The day Drew finally stood at the clinic's threshold, ready to leave, felt surreal. Nicholas waited by a sleek black car, a reminder of the life Drew had paused but not yet abandoned. Mayara stood beside him, her arms crossed protectively. Carla had been moved to a more comfortable ward, thanks to Drew's intervention, but the tension between them lingered like an unspoken goodbye. "I'll come back," Drew said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. Mayara nodded, though her expression was unreadable. "You don't owe us anything," she said quietly. "What you've done for Carla, for me, it's more than I ever expected." "I don't do it because I owe you," Drew replied. "I do it because I want to." Mayara's eyes softened, but the cautious distance remained. "Just don't lose yourself again," she said, her tone almost pleading. As Drew slid into the car, the weight of her words settled in his chest. The journey back to the city felt like entering a foreign land. The towering skyscrapers, the opulent offices, they all felt lifeless compared to the warmth of the clinic and the people who had saved him in more ways than one. Back at his penthouse, Drew stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the city he once ruled. The phone rang incessantly, messages piling up with demands for his attention. Yet, for the first time, Drew ignored them all. Instead, he opened his laptop and began drafting a plan, not for another acquisition, but for a life he could live with pride. A life where his wealth could mean something beyond profit. A life that could bring him back to Mayara and the fragile connection he wasn't willing to let go of. Drew's return brought an undeniable shift to the clinic. Patients and staff alike noticed the quiet determination in his presence. He wasn't just passing through, he was rooted, his every action purposeful. Yet, as he spent more time with Mayara and Carla, the weight of their bond began to test the walls that had shielded his heart for so long. One evening, as the three sat together in Carla's room, Drew shared stories of his travels. Carla's eyes lit up at his tales of Paris, her laughter filling the space like sunlight breaking through a storm. "You've been everywhere," Carla said, her voice tinged with wonder. "I can't even imagine what that must be like." Drew hesitated, his gaze shifting to Mayara. "It's not the places that matter," he said quietly. "It's who you have with you." Mayara's cheeks flushed, but she quickly looked away, focusing on smoothing Carla's blanket. Drew wanted to say more, but he held back. He had learned the value of patience, of letting things grow naturally instead of forcing them. But not everything came easily. The board continued to demand his attention, their calls relentless. Nicholas arrived one day, bringing contracts that required Drew's signature. As Mayara watched from a distance, her expression unreadable, Drew faced a choice that would shape his future. "Walk away," Nicholas urged after Drew hesitated. This life isn't for you. Drew glanced at Mayara, her presence grounding him in the chaos of his thoughts. For the first time, he felt sure of his answer. This life, he said firmly, is the only one that matters. Nicholas left, but the tension lingered. That night, Drew found Mayara alone in the clinic's small garden. "I'm not going anywhere," he said softly. "I hope you know that by now." Mayara's walls finally crumbled as she turned to him, her voice trembling. "I just don't want to lose you." "You won't," Drew promised, sealing the words with a quiet, steady embrace. The day Carla was discharged from the clinic was one of joy and bittersweet farewells. Drew watched as Mayara guided her sister into the sunlight, her face alight with relief and hope. Carla clutched Drew's hand tightly. "Thank you for everything," she whispered. "It's not over yet," Drew replied with a smile. True to his word, Drew had planned a surprise, a modest apartment in a safe neighborhood, fully paid for, where Mayara and Carla could start anew. When Mayara saw it, her eyes widened with disbelief. "Drew, it's home," he interrupted gently. "For both of you. Somewhere to heal, to dream again." Tears filled Mayara's eyes, but this time she didn't hesitate. Wrapping her arms around him, she let the gratitude and affection she had kept hidden pour out. Over the months that followed, their lives intertwined further. Drew divided his time between his foundation and the quiet moments he cherished with Mayara and Carla. He no longer wore the title of CEO like a badge of honor. Instead, he was a man rebuilding his life, one meaningful step at a time. One evening, as they sat together in the warm glow of the apartment, Drew took Mayara's hand. "I don't know where this journey leads," he said, his voice steady, "but I know I want to take it with you." Mayara smiled, her eyes reflecting a mixture of trust and love. "Then let's take it one step at a time," she replied. As the city buzzed outside their window, Drew felt something he hadn't in years: peace. He had lost an empire, but gained something far greater: a life filled with love, purpose, and the promise of a future built together. In the end, the Millionaire's second chance reminds us of a powerful truth. The greatest wealth isn't measured by money, but by the connections we build and the love we give. Drew's journey from isolation to purpose shows that even the most broken hearts can find healing when they open themselves to others. If this story moved you, let it inspire others too. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder of what truly matters. Leave a comment with your thoughts. What would you sacrifice for love? Don't forget to like this video, and if you want more stories that touch your soul, subscribe to our channel. Let's keep spreading stories of transformation, one heart at a time.